So this first talk is about Elizabeth Louisa Mather, who was the sole suffragette of East Haddam in our town's history. Born in Millington on January 7, 1815, she was the second child of Nathan Lanesford Foster and his wife, Azure Combe, daughter of well-landed local resident William Combe. Nathan L. Foster was born in Massachusetts, the son of Reverend Joel Foster, and was a student at Harvard. Seeking a place to practice law, teach, and become a successful writer, he chose East Haddam, arriving in 1809 at age 22. Just why he picked us, I never was able to find out. But we were very lucky he did. The following year, he married Azure Combe, and they raised 10 children between 1813 and 1833. So that's one kid every 2 years. Almost immediately, Nathan became town clerk, treasurer, and set up private schools where he taught classic literature and composition skills. From birth, Louisa, as she is always called, was Nathan's favorite, and he taught her well. For most of her young life, Louisa was moved from one rental to another, depending on where her father taught school, whether Millington, Moodus, Little Haddam, Mount Parnassus, or Hadlime. From 1819 to 1823, the family lived in Hartford, where two of Louisa's siblings were born. When that private school closed, the family returned to East Haddam and settled atop Town Hill in an old house which stood where the present Captain George Comer House stands today. While on Town Hill, Nathan sent and received so much mail as town clerk and treasurer that he convinced the state to set up a post office for him and the school district, which was granted in 1833. Unsatisfied with the name Town Hill, the town hall in those days stood across the road at a point which is exactly the geographic center of East Haddam, he decided to rename the district as Mount Parnassus, after the classic mountain in Greece, not far from the residence of the oracle at Delphi. I mean, how much more classical can you get? A few years later, Louisa met Eleazer Watrous Mather, son of physician Dr. Augustus Mather of Millington Green. Unlike his father, Eleazer decided early on to remain a simple farmer, but added the profession of skilled butcher to his business efforts. Since telephones, email, etc. did not exist in those days, young people were forced to communicate by mail, since unchaperoned get-togethers were still frowned upon. Several of Louisa's poems to Eleazer by mail and his poems to her, both before and after their marriage, have survived. In 1829, Nathan and his family relocated to Hadlime, where he had purchased the old Hadlime Church parsonage on Old Town Street. Despite her mother's membership in the Millington Congregational Church, where she was married, her father preferred St. Stephen's Episcopal. Perhaps family disagreements over the principles of the different denominations caused both Eleazer and Louisa to become practitioners of Universalism after their marriage at St. Stephen's in 1837. Universalists uphold the belief in universal salvation, and Louisa embraced this belief in the equality of all life in her poems and essays about nature, love, friendship, and injustice. Eleazer and Louisa had 4 children, 3 daughters and 1 son, between 1838 and 1854. Only one of their daughters seemed to share their love of poetry. For some unknown reason, in 1840, Nathan uprooted his family and moved to Philadelphia. Again, have no idea why. Only Louisa and her sister Marie, the wife of John Holmes, remained in East Haddam. However, Nathan did not sell the old parsonage, just in case his legal and educational prospects did not pan out in Philadelphia. He did find time in 1841 to publish a small book of poems entitled The Last of His Family, a copy of which is housed in the Rathbun Library's historical reading room. The Foster family never did return to East Haddam. Eloise's mother died in 1859, and Nathan died in 1861. 5 years later, Eloisa bought out the shares that her siblings had inherited in Nathan's estate, and she became the sole owner of the old Hadline parsonage. On occasion, she also taught school, just like her father, in the Millington Green schoolhouse. In all of her writings, I did not find any suggestion that Eloisa was an abolitionist. As a Universalist, one would think she would have spoken out for the freedom for the African American slaves. During the Civil War and its aftermath, Eloisa began corresponding with many influential persons. John Greenleaf Whittier sent her encouragement on her poetry. Quaker Lucretia Mott convinced Eloisa to continue publishing suffrage messages. Eloisa also corresponded with Lucy, wife of famed naturalist J. Audubon. Her son Nathan was a proud owner of one of Mr. Audubon's violins. She even corresponded with the famed suffragette sisters Julia and Abigail Smith of Glastonbury, who refused to pay taxes on the grounds that they did not have the right to vote. 1871 was a pivotal year for the suffrage movement. In 1871, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution gave free male African Americans the right to vote. This caused a stir in East Haddam, and on March 1st, 1871, the following East Haddam African American men became registered voters, namely David O. Mosley of Moodus, Jesse and Lyman W. Caples, Thomas Webster, and William and Lorenzo Mason of Millington. All suffrage leaders were emboldened, and Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott encouraged their correspondents to march on local registrars' offices and demand to be registered as voters. In East Haddam, Eloisa and 9 of her ardent female followers, who were never named, went to the office of registrars Robert W. Chapman and Charles E. Brownell, and their assistants Amos Day and Zachariah Hungerford. This was on April 20th, 1871. Eloisa wrote about this visit in a letter to Susan B. Anthony, which was published in the journal The Revolution, which was founded by Ms. Anthony. I quote from that nationally published letter. We presented the names of 10 women, mine included, before the Board of Registrars, who refused to register our names as a preliminary to voting under the 14th and 15th Amendments. Also, we went before the Board of Selectmen and Town Clerk, but they declined to qualify us for voting, stating that they were acting under state laws and as a state board. I inquired which should be paramount, the United States laws or those of the state. Finally, on the 3rd of April, I accompanied my husband to the town hall to proffer my vote, my husband stating to the moderator of the meeting my refusal by the Board of Registration of my legal qualifications for voting. The moderator said that as a preliminary to voting, I must produce my affidavit that I had been thus refused. And so on the spot, I made the required affidavit. But after all, my vote was not received. But I do not consider the time lost by any means, for it has aroused many to examine the subject, and agitation is decidedly necessary to induce people to look into the merits of our cause." End quote. Depressed over her failure to spread the cause of Universalism, she once wrote that except for several papers that she had received, she felt as solitary of liberal friends as Robinson Crusoe on his island. Despite this rejection, Eloisa returned to the polls in 1872 and attempted to vote, only to be refused again. However, in New York, when Susan B. Anthony attempted to vote, She was arrested for violating state law. At her trial in 1873, she was found guilty, given a prison sentence and a fine. She, however, never spent a day in jail and refused to pay the fine. This trial caused a small stir in the national newspapers, but little came of it. In early 1876, Louisa obtained a press pass for the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. While at the Centennial, she spent many hours conferring with her friend, Lucretia Mott. On January 18, 1881, she wrote and published her most notable essay on advocating for the abolition of capital punishment. In late 1881, Louisa developed a tumor in her neck, which was apparently untreatable. She died February 2, 1882, at the age of 66, and was buried in the Hungerford Cemetery in Haddam, a private burial yard. Her husband died on November 20, 1887, at age 75, and was buried next to her. In her obituary in the Connecticut Valley Advertiser, it was written that she considered, and I quote, the whole human family as one brotherhood, end quote. It always seemed odd to me that Louisa and Eleazer were not buried in the large Foster lot in First Church Cemetery, and that none of her children are buried with her. The lone grave in the Foster lot at First Church contains the remains of Louisa's 5-month-old brother, William Cone Foster, who died in 1817. After the passing of Eleazer Mather, suffrage activities in East Haddam diminished. Apparently, no one came forward to lead the movement for women's rights here. After 1900, the movement nationally became more and more active, with marches on Washington, women protesters becoming arrested and imprisoned, some even in prison resorting to hunger strikes. Finally, Congress passed the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, giving women the right to vote in 1919, after President Wilson gave up his fight against the amendment. At least 36 states needed to ratify this amendment before it became law. In Connecticut, Senator Brundage fought against ratification, and Governor Holcomb refused to call a special meeting to vote on it. However, after Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify, the Connecticut legislature convened, and in September of 1920, we became the 37th state to ratify. Registrations for the November election that were to be set up between September 18th and October 19th. East Haddam preserved its registration records from that time period, and I made a list of all 207 East Haddam women who registered. They ranged in ages from 21 to 82 and consisted of mill and shop workers, teachers, nurses, milliners, chambermaids, store clerks, some farmers, one artist, one beekeeper, and one postal worker. Many had been born abroad in Europe and Canada, but became naturalized citizens. The names of many will be familiar to some of you older members present. They were Carrie Alexander, Mary Bigelow, Catherine Chafee Roberts, Blanche Brownell Cross, Gladys Cone Davis, Mary Doherty, Dorothy Day Durfee, Helen Thomas Fowler, Alice Burkett Erickson, Frances Rathbun, Adelaide Root, and Mary Virginia Wakeman. Many were noticeably missing from the list, most notably Hala Hungerford Brownell and Anna Williams Morgan. Only one of Louisa's children survived to see the fruition of their mother's suffrage efforts. It was her oldest daughter, Mary Helen, wife of merchant Roswell D. Spencer, who lived in Lyme in 1920. For those who want to learn more, a book of Eleazer Mather's poems and prose entitled From Hadlime Hills was published by her granddaughter, Catherine Dixon Wright, and her great-granddaughter, Priscilla Wright Pratt, in 1956. A copy of this very hard-to-find book is in the history reading room of the Rathbun Library.